right, so listen to this one, you guys. This true crime case is wild. It's got small-town secrets, a cold case that went unsolved for decades, and a twist you won't believe. We're going deep into the murder of Mandy Stavik in Acme, Washington back in 1989.
Acme, Washington.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the perfect picture of a peaceful small town. And that's what makes it even more shocking when a crime like this happens. It just shatters that sense of safety.
For sure. And the sources you gave me, those excerpts from the 48 Hours episode about this case, really show just how much this impacted that community.
Yeah.
So Mandy Stavik, 19 years old, a bright, ambitious young woman, home from college for Thanksgiving break, cheerleader, basketball player, top student. She even wanted to be an airline pilot.
Big dreams, you know? It's almost like the bigger the dreams, the harder the fall. And so that Thanksgiving break, after having dinner with her family, Mandy goes out for a jog with her dog, Kyra. And that's the last anyone sees her alive.
Tragic. 3 days later, her body is found in the South Fork of the Nooksack River. Just her running shoes still on murder. Evidence showed it was abduction, sexual assault, and murder.
It's amazing to me that even back then in 1989, the lead detective, Ron Peterson, thought to preserve DNA evidence. DNA technology was so new then, but he just knew it could be important.
It's like he could see the future, that this tiny detail would be what solved the case someday. So at first, the investigation focused on the usual suspects, local drifters, persons of interest. Even Mandy's boyfriend was questioned.
Yeah.
But even though they got DNA samples from over 30 local men, all the leads just went cold.
Total dead end, right?
Veins.
You have this horrible crime, the evidence is right there, but nothing. I can't even imagine how frustrated everyone must felt.
Totally. And that's how it stayed for 25 years. A cold case that haunted the community and a family with no answers. Then in 2009, Detective Kevin Bowie takes over the case.
That's often where a fresh perspective helps. A new detective who wasn't part of the first investigation might see things differently.
Yeah. You're right, Bowie was super thorough, going over those old files, looking at everything again. And one name kept coming up. John Wisniewski, a drug dealer who had said he knew something about the murder.
So even though his DNA wasn't a match, there was something about him that kept making the investigators curious. It makes you wonder what he knew or thought he knew.
Exactly. Bowie even flew all the way to Cambodia, where Wisniewski was living, then to question him again. But it was another dead end.
Like taking one step forward and two steps back. All that hope gone. I wonder how Mandy's family felt.
It's heartbreaking to think about. But then, this is where it gets crazy. In 2013, the case takes a huge turn, and it all starts at a water park.
A water park. You wouldn't think that's where a big break in a murder case would happen.
Right. So there are these two mothers, Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson. Both went to Mount Baker High, just like Mandy. They're at the water park watching their kids. And somehow Mandy's name comes up.
And they knew something, right?
They did. Turns out they both had creepy encounters with the same guy years ago. And both of them thought he might be involved in Mandy's murder. And who was this guy?
Tim Bass.
Hold on, Tim Bass. Didn't you say Mandy's jogging route went right past his house back in '89? Exactly. And after all these years, these two moms just happened to be at the same place and finally felt like they had to say something. It's like fate.
Makes you wonder about coincidence in these cases. Sometimes it's the smallest, most random connections that lead to the truth.
So let's go back to 1989 and talk about Tim Bass. He had what seemed like a normal life in a town nearby, married with 3 kids, worked as a delivery driver for a bakery. No criminal record, just your average guy.
But hold on, remember his brother Tom and his ex-wife Gina, they both said he was controlling, had some really sexist views, and would act weird towards women. Tom even remembered Tim firing a gun during a fight with a girlfriend.
Those details definitely paint a different picture.
Yeah.
It makes you think what was really going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. Was Tim Bass really living a normal life, or was he just good at hiding his true self? Pretty scary to think about.
So when the police finally talked to Tim, he first said he didn't even know Mandy. Then he changes his story and says he barely remembers her.
Huge red flag, right? Those inconsistencies would definitely make them suspicious. And when they asked for a DNA sample,
He refused. Said he'd seen enough crime shows to know how DNA evidence can put innocent people in jail.
Interesting. So he knew how important DNA was, but still wouldn't cooperate. That just makes him seem even more suspicious. How did the police get his DNA then?
They put him under surveillance, hoping he'd throw away something with his DNA on it while he was out on his delivery route. They needed a lucky break.
You always need some luck in these cases, but you also need to be persistent. And speaking of persistent, this is where Kim Wagner comes in. Remember her? She was Tim's boss at the bakery.
Oh, yeah. She knew about the investigation, and she had a weird feeling about Tim. She thought he was strange and didn't treat women well.
So she was in a tough position working with him every day while thinking he might be involved in something awful. What did she do?
She decided to help the police, but she had to be careful. For 3 months, she watched Tim waiting for him to throw away something. They could use a cup, a can, anything.
3 months. That's some serious dedication. She wanted to do the right thing, even if it meant putting herself at risk.
And then finally, Tim threw away a plastic cup and a Coke can disc. Kim grabbed them and gave them to the police.
Talk about a turning point. You never know how one person's actions can completely change a case. It's amazing.
And the DNA matched. After 28 years, they finally had their guy. Tim Bass was arrested on December 12, 2017, charged with kidnapping, raping, and murdering Mandy.
It must have been a whirlwind of emotions for everyone. Relief for Mandy's family and the police who worked so hard. But for Tim Bass, it was just the beginning. I mean, after almost 30 years, it must have felt unbelievable for everyone involved and a trial coming up. But even with the DNA match, things were far from over.
Oh, yeah. The trial was a wild ride, let me tell you. The prosecution's case seemed pretty open and shut. They had the DNA linking Tim Bass to Mandy's body, but the defense had a crazy strategy.
The defense always trying to spin things. What were they thinking in this case?
Okay, so get this. They claimed that Tim Bass and Mandy Stavik had a sexual relationship. And it was consensual. I mean, remember, he first said he didn't even know her.
That's completely the opposite of what he said at first. It's a big risk, especially with the DNA evidence right there. Did they have anything to support this claim?
Not really. No witnesses, no phone records, nothing to show they even knew each other. But the defense argued that just because no one saw them together doesn't mean it didn't happen. Maybe they said it was a secret affair. That would explain the DNA, but make the rape and kidnapping charges less believable.
A classic way to try and create reasonable doubt. And in a case like this where there's no one who saw the crime happen, any little bit of doubt could influence the jury.
And to make things even more complicated, the defense brought in their own forensic expert. This expert said that the DNA evidence the semen found on Mandy's body could have been there for up to 2 days before she died.
That changes things a lot. If the DNA was there earlier, it messes up the prosecution's timeline.
For sure. It means the sexual encounter might not have happened at the same time as the murder. But the prosecution's expert, the original medical examiner from back in 1989, totally disagreed. He stuck with what he said originally, that everything pointed to the assault and murder happening right around the time they found her body.
So it became a battle of the experts, each one explaining the evidence their own way, trying to convince the jury.
The jury had to figure out who to believe with all these different opinions. It must have been tough.
Absolutely. And on top of the scientific evidence, there was some testimony that really showed what kind of person Tim Bass was. Remember his ex-wife, Gina? She said he was controlling and maybe even abusive.
Yeah, her testimony was scary.
Yeah.
She told the court that Tim tried to get his own mother to lie for him and give him a fake alibi. He even suggested they blame his dead father for Mandy's murder.
Wow. Trying to shift the blame like that shows how desperate he was, and it really makes you question his character and whether you can trust anything he says.
And then there's his brother, Tom. Remember how Tom wouldn't lie for Tim when Tim asked him to say he had slept with Mandy too?
Oh, yeah. It's like Tim was trying to make Mandy look bad to somehow make it harder to believe she was assaulted.
Exactly. And during the trial, Tom said that after Tim got arrested, Tim bugged him for a good alibi and even asked their mom to lie.
So there's a pattern of behavior there.
Right.
Instead of saying he's innocent, he's trying to hide things.
Yeah.
Which usually makes things worse in these cases.
And that's what the prosecution said, that everything Tim did before and after the arrest showed that he knew he was guilty.
It's a common argument. When someone lies and tries to cover things up, it makes them look guilty.
Right. If he was innocent, why not just focus on proving that instead of making up stories?
True. But the defense said even innocent people can act weird when they're under pressure. They said Tim was scared, confused, and didn't understand what was happening.
I mean, that makes sense. The stress of a murder investigation, especially after so many years, can be overwhelming. People react differently. Some are more rational than others.
So in the end, it was up to the jury to decide. They had to look at all the evidence, the different testimonies, and figure out if Tim Bass was guilty, without a doubt. That's a huge responsibility. Thinking about what happened 30 years ago, understanding the science and deciding who's telling the truth. It's a lot of pressure, knowing their decision will change people's lives.
They spent 9 days in trial and 5 long hours discussing everything before they made a decision.
It must have been so tense in the courtroom while they waited for the verdict. What happened?
Guilty. They found Tim Bass guilty of murder, rape, and kidnapping. It was a victory for Mandy's family and for justice after all those years.
Justice was delayed, but it finally came. After 29 years, Mandy's family could finally start to move on. But the story's not over, is it?
Not quite. The sentencing was just as emotional as the trial. Mandy's family couldn't even speak, so her brother-in-law spoke for them and asked for the harshest sentence. He said Tim Bass should never be free again.
Powerful statement. It really shows how much pain and anger they must have felt. This wasn't just a case to them, it was about losing someone they loved.
And then Tim's mother spoke. She defended her son and said he was innocent. It must have been so sad. Two families connected by this horrible event, both dealing with their own grief.
It shows how much these crimes affect everyone. It's not just the victim and the person who did it, it's the families, the friends, the whole community that's forever changed by what happened.
When it was Tim's turn to speak, he still said he was innocent and that the trial wasn't fair. But the judge didn't believe him and gave him the maximum sentence, almost 27 years in prison.
That's a long time. It shows how serious the crime was. But it still leaves us with a question, doesn't it?
What do you mean?
Well, Tim Bass will probably spend the rest of his life in prison, but we still don't know why he did this. What was going on inside him that made him do something so terrible?
Yeah, it is creepy to think someone can seem so normal, blend in with everyone else, but have this dark side. Even with the DNA and the guilty verdict, some people still aren't sure about Tim Bass.
That's how it is with true crime a lot of times.
Yeah.
More questions than answers. And yeah, this case is definitely like that. But when you look at everything, the DNA, the fact that he kept changing his story, trying to get people to lie for him, it's hard to ignore.
It really is a lot to take in. For the people who worked on this case for years, though, that verdict must have felt amazing. Detective Bowie, Kim Wagner. They all helped get justice for Mandy.
And for Mandy's family, they can finally start to heal, even though they'll never forget what happened.
This case shows that even in places that seem perfect like Acme, this small town where everyone knows each other, bad things can still happen. It makes you realize that nowhere is completely safe.
And it shows how important it is to be aware and pay attention, both for the police and for regular people. Remember those moms talking at the water park? It seemed like a random conversation, but that's what helps solve this case. It proves that speaking up, even years later, can really make a difference.
Definitely. We can't forget about how far science has come, especially with DNA. This case might never have been solved without it. It makes you wonder how many other cold cases could be solved with this technology.
It gives hope to families who've been waiting forever for answers for justice. It shows that even the coldest cases can be cracked and the truth can come out.
What do you think about Tim Bass saying he had a secret relationship with Mandy? Do you believe him, or was he just trying to get out of trouble?
Tough to say. There's nothing to prove it, really, so it's hard to know if he's telling the truth. He might have just been trying to make the jury doubt the evidence,
This case has been a wild ride for sure. So much evidence, different stories and questions we still don't have answers to. It makes you think about how complicated people are, the fight for justice, and how the truth always finds a way out in the end. That's it for our deep dive this week. Thanks for listening.